Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So we are moving on to a new critical approach today. We are talking about the psychological critical approach. So this is a pretty popular one. This is an approach that many of us might be inclined to take, especially if we have an interest in psychology, if we have taken a class in that area. This is an approach that we can definitely use. We do not have to be psychologists or psychiatrists. We don't have to be experts in the field to be able to use this approach. You guys have probably seen some examples of this in the past. It is pretty common for critics and scholars to psychoanalyze characters or to view a literary text through a psychological lens. Now, this can mean a lot of different things. You can take a lot of different approaches within this larger approach. You can decide what you want to look at. You might be mostly focused on the motivations of characters, why characters are doing the things that they are doing, what are their psychological motivations. In other cases, you might be interested simply in the mental state of characters. And that could be considered a psychological reading. What the book is mostly talking about is trying to understand the meaning of texts, largely through a psychological lens. And you can also do that. You can certainly use psychology to help you to understand a theme, to help you understand what a text is trying to express, or what a text is trying to do. So this is just another option that we can use when we analyze literature, another critical approach that we can choose from. So before we jump into this, I just want to talk a little bit about our upcoming schedule. Okay, so just to keep track, so far we have covered two critical approaches. We've discussed formalism, and then last week we talked about structuralism and post-structuralism, which we are considering the linguistic approaches. So we're kind of classifying those together. So now we move into our third approach this week, which obviously is psychological. And we're going to sort of do more of this kind of work over the next few weeks. We're going to cover a few more approaches, kind of moving quickly. So next week, we're going to cover mythology and archetypes. So reading literature through a sort of mythological lens. We'll talk about that. Then in week 10, we cover feminism and gender studies. And then in week 11, it's cultural studies. So those are the remaining approaches that we still need to cover. And then by week 12, we will be working on our second critical response paper. And for that second critical response, you will choose from all of the approaches that we have learned since formalism. We all used formalism for our first critical approach. So for the for the first critical response. So for your second critical response, you can choose structuralism, post-structuralism, the psychological approach, or any of the stuff that we cover over the next 3 weeks. All right. So that's just a little bit of a look ahead. And then after week 12, we will be spending the rest of the semester really focusing on our final paper. So I won't really have new approaches for you after week 12. We cover everything by then, and then we start working on the big paper. But of course, we're going to need to be using one or more of these critical approaches on that big paper as well. So just to give you a sense of what to expect, and just to give you a range of the different critical approaches that we will be covering. I don't expect us to like all of these. Hopefully you will find at least one or two critical approaches that you like and can use. So let's get into the psychological approach more, talk about what it is, but more importantly, how can we use it? So as the book points out, this is one of the more utilized, one of the more popular of the critical approaches, but you might be able to detect in chapter 6 that the authors of our book are at least a little bit skeptical of the psychological approach. They recommend it for certain things, but you'll also notice that they issue a lot of warnings about the limitations of the psychological approach. And they suggest that it might be one of the more controversial, one of the more abused, or perhaps overused of the critical approaches. But they also point out that it has become quite mainstream in recent decades. That just means a lot of people use this approach. So, one thing they point out, and this is probably true, is that the psychological approach can help us to better understand individual elements within a literary text. So, for example, like I was saying, we could use this approach to better understand characters or to better understand a theme at work in a particular text, or to better understand certain symbols that might be important in a text, certain examples of symbolism. We could do all of that, but as the book says, the psychological approach will not help us very much when we want to talk about structure or form or just the overall artistry of a text. So the way they put it, and I've heard it put this way at other times, the psychological approach can help us to read between the lines, or in some cases to read beneath the lines. But it's not going to tell us very much about the lines themselves. So in other words, this is a good way to sort of understand meaning, but it's not going to allow you to talk very much about the structure of a poem or the structure of a novel, or other aspects of form like rhyme scheme, or point of view, or stanza. So that kind of stuff that we were really getting into with formalism, when we were really interested in organic form and how these literary texts were built and how the language was working in these individual sort of elements like rhyme or meter or metaphor or irony. The psychological approach can help with some of that, but it's not going to be able to tell us very much about form, structure. That's what they mean when they say it won't tell us much about the lines themselves. It might tell us about hidden meanings beneath the lines. But if we're just interested in rhythm, structure, that kind of stuff, the psychological approach probably won't be very helpful with those things. But the formalist approach would be, or if we're really interested in language, we might want to gravitate back towards the structuralist approach. So that's part of how you can make your future decisions about which critical approach you want to use. It really might boil down to, what are you interested in? Are you interested in the meaning behind the lines, or do you want to talk more about the lines themselves? Just something to consider. They also point out that, like a lot of these other critical approaches, like versions of these approaches have been around for a long time. So that's true of the psychological approach as well. They show an example of, Aristotle back in ancient Greece talking about certain ideas, certain concepts that we would still think are pretty important today if we are viewing literature through a psychological lens. So famously, Aristotle defines tragedy as, well, he defines it in a lot of ways, but one of the many things that he says tragedy does, and of course for him tragedy was a certain type of play, a certain type of stage drama that was popular in ancient Greece, still popular, maybe in different forms today. But he said one of the many things that a tragedy should do is it evoke certain emotions in the audience. And one of those key emotional experiences that an audience should have, he described as catharsis. So that's like sort of like a release, or sort of like an emotional reaction to what you're seeing that can often be sort of a release of tension or a release of a lot of other sort of complex emotions. And it's a real sort of palpable, almost physical thing that audience members can feel. And again, his point is that's part of what tragedy does, is it makes readers feel that way. So in other words, we are talking about certain psychological effects on audiences, right? So we still talk about that today. That might be a way that we evaluate a particular work of art. We're definitely going to talk about how it makes audiences feel. Remember, we talked about the reader response critical approach, which kind of came up as a pushback against formalism. They were very interested, the reader response critics were very interested in how readers felt, after reading something, their emotional response to a text. So that can also be considered here. We can think about the psychological effects on readers, but we can also see examples in the past of other critics looking for other kinds of psychological effects. So we've talked about, like with the rise of the novel back in like the 1700s, at least the English language novel, I've told you guys that a lot of critics and scholars back then thought that novels should have a moral lesson that they could teach readers. There was a lot of controversy, believe it or not, back then as to whether or not it was good to read novels. A lot of people thought novels were kind of a bad influence, particularly on young people. Very similar to what you hear older folks saying about, just go through the generations. It's the same stuff people said about TV. Same stuff people said about the internet, a lot of the same stuff that you might hear today about social media and the negative impacts it can have on young people. Now, I think some of those concerns have been valid, but others might be overblown. But there was this idea back then that novels would corrupt young people. These like romance novels or adventure novels, they would make young people idle. If you guys know the meaning of that, like lazy. They, instead of going out and working or like helping their parents, the kids would just be sitting around and reading all the time. They would just be reading these sort of, artificial, entertaining, but not very deep, stories. So there was a concern about that. So as a way to kind of counter that, you had a lot of, critics, but also novelists themselves claiming that, their novels would teach valuable moral lessons. So there would be a good reason for, people to read it because they would learn proper conduct, or they would learn what not to do. They would learn how to handle certain situations. And we still kind of think along those lines today. Like we've discussed in the past, we might associate this a little bit more with like children's literature. We expect children's lit to have a clear moral or some kind of lesson that the kid will learn after reading it. Like we still kind of expect that with kids stuff, but with literature intended for adult audiences, we don't always look for a moral, but sometimes we do. And sometimes that's still, on our minds as readers. So we haven't completely dropped the idea that there is sort of a desirable psychological effect that a good work of literature might have on a person. Not only will we have an emotional connection as the reader, we'll connect to the characters, the themes, but also we're going to learn like how to act, or we're going to learn like the right ways to feel, the right ways to maybe go about certain things. So we could view that as a psychological effect as well. And even the English romantic poets like Percy Shelley, the husband of Mary Shelley, they were also interested in the psychological effects of literature. They were specifically interested in sort of like the powers of the imagination and how certain things in nature, certain phenomenon, when described in poetry, could evoke these very powerful feelings in people, and in some cases could inspire people to then go and be imaginative. So they thought if you walked around in nature and saw a bunch of tall mountains and beautiful forests and pristine lakes, that was going to do something to your imagination. Being around those things would spark some kind of creative energy. They didn't really understand how the brain worked all that well, but they had this sense that the imagination was kind of a psychological effect. It was something that could be harnessed. It was something that could be fired up or suppressed in people based on what they were being exposed to, based on what they were seeing and experiencing, which, they weren't totally wrong about that. They didn't really understand the process in a deep, scientific or medical way, but we still think about the powers of imagination today, and we can still be inspired to create art. That's still very much a thing. And we might think of that as a psychological byproduct of being, seeing art, reading art, consuming literature, or any kind of art, really. So we've been interested in some of this stuff for a long time, but much of what we would consider like the modern psychological approach really comes from our concepts of psychoanalysis, as they were sort of defined by Sigmund Freud, very famous psychoanalyst from the early 20th century. And we don't necessarily go along with all of his teachings anymore. He was, he's considered a little bit outdated in some respects, but when it comes to this kind of critical approach, a lot of our concepts come from him. A lot of the ways that we utilize the psychological approach do come from Freud and some of the concepts and theories that he came up with, well over a century ago. So like I was saying, we don't have to be experts. We don't have to become psychoanalysts, but we need to know a little bit about these concepts if we ever want to use this approach on any work of literature that we use. So to this day, we still know a little bit of Freud's vocabulary. This isn't just stuff that comes up in literature or, of course, in the mental health profession. These are terms that we use kind of all the time, at least some of these. So we might be familiar. And you might know that Freud's sort of main contribution to modern psychology is his emphasis on the unconscious aspects of the human mind. So this was really where he was kind of a trailblazer, and this is how psychoanalysis is a little bit different from other branches of, psychiatry or, mental health professional work. Psychoanalysis is really focused on the unconscious mind. So that means things that we aren't actively conscious of. You might think of this as sort of subconscious or totally unconscious, not a conscious thought, not something that you're really aware of in your waking hours. But these are desires, feelings, fears that are often deep within us. And we might not be fully aware of them. That's why we would go to therapy and talk to a psychoanalyst who would help us get in touch with our unconscious mind. And Freud theorized that we often have very little control over our unconscious mind because we are not conscious of it. We are not really aware of it. So we're not always capable of really controlling it or regulating it very well. So he says a lot of what we do, a lot of our actions, a lot of the things that we want are really driven by unconscious desires that we don't understand or that we're not even aware of. So they are beneath the surface. And through talking to a therapist, we might be able to better understand them. So this is pretty mainstream today. Like when Freud came out with a lot of these ideas, they were pretty new. But now most people kind of accept this, and a lot of people go to therapy very much to get in touch with their unconscious mind. And even today, a lot of mental health professionals would still argue that a lot of human mental processes are unconscious. We can become more aware of them, but that takes work. But Freud has other ideas that we don't necessarily subscribe to anymore. Again, he was working a long time ago. We've made a lot more advancements since then. So the book points out that, there are some limitations to a psychoanalytic approach, but certainly you can use it to try to get to the bottom of character motivation. You can also use it to help you understand theme, but we're not necessarily going to be faithful to Freud and all of his ideas. We're mostly just kind of focused on these ideas of psychoanalysis and getting in touch with the unconscious mind. So some of his vocabulary that we still use this terminology, so you guys should know these terms: id, ego, and superego. So these might come in handy if you are using a psychological approach to analyze a work of literature. So you probably heard of id, right? The id is the reservoir of a lot of our unconscious desires. This is also the source of a lot of human sexuality, according to Freud and others. And it's the source of a lot of our desires, a lot of our aggressions. So when you hear the id described, it's often described as very lawless. It's asocial, it's amoral, right? It's kind of selfish. It's very much focused on the pleasure principle. So again, these are just all parts of the human mind, right? So we're sort of imagining the id as just a part of all of our brains, all of our minds, right? And the id is where a lot of our desires reside. We're not always fully conscious of what's going on with our id. We're not always fully capable of controlling our id. And again, the id is not interested in morality. The id is not interested in other people. It's solely focused on the individual pleasure principle, pursuing whatever we want, whatever we like, whatever brings us pleasure. So obviously, if we allow the id to go unchecked, that can be a problem. And that might be how you've heard this term used, right? We often talk about children as having kind of unregulated ids. And you guys know this, right? If you're dealing with a little kid, right, they want what they want. And they don't really care if it's moral or if it makes sense for them to get it. They just want it, right? They are mostly driven by their desires. They don't really care if it's right or wrong or if it's a good idea or a bad idea. If they want ice cream, they want it, right? They don't care that it's almost dinner time. They don't care that they had ice cream yesterday. They want it. And if they don't get it, they're going to be upset. They might cry because they don't have a good mechanism for controlling their id. So the id is kind of lawless and chaotic. It's all about desires. So we all have this, but we of course have to control it. So that's where the ego and the superego come in. So those are the two regulating agencies in our minds. Okay, those are the two things that are trying to keep the id in check. But the ego and superego are a little bit different. So the ego represents good sense and reason. All right. So the ego really encompasses a lot of our conscious mind. And this is funny. I mean, there's been a lot of good reports, a lot of good research done about this. When you talk to people, when you interview people about their own mental processes and their own psychological state, most people like to believe that they are very rational. Right? We all recognize that we have emotions. Sometimes we have very strong emotions. But we like to think that we make most of our decisions, that we base most of our behavior around reason, common sense, rationality. And that is the ego. But a lot of mental health professionals will say we're kind of deceiving ourselves. We're kind of lying to ourselves because the ego is not nearly as strong as the id. So you can think of the ego as like your conscious mind, like the way that we sort of want to be perceived, the way that we want to be, right? Sort of recognizing that we need to make good decisions. We need to do the right thing. We need to do the things that are sort of going to work well with others, right? So these are more of our conscious thoughts, right? It's the unconscious that's so chaotic. Our conscious minds are usually pretty well ordered and reasonable, but a lot of psychoanalysts would say, yeah, but your conscious mind is a very small percentage of your mind. Like most of the action is happening with your unconscious mind. So we like to tell ourselves that we're rational. We like to tell ourselves that the ego is in charge, but really the ego is not as strong as the id. So we need another regulating agent, and that is the superego. So the superego is more concerned about society and conforming to moral and social standards. So this is kind of interesting to think about. The ego is more about yourself. You want to be a rational person. You want to do the things that are mostly going to be good for you and sort of, what strikes you as common sense. But the superego is more concerned about other people. The superego is more concerned about how you're going to be perceived by the larger society. And most people have the desire to more or less fit in with some larger community. community or larger society around them. It might depend on where you live and who you're with, but we all want to belong to something bigger. But in order to belong to a larger community, we have to follow certain standards. We have to respect certain norms if we want to get along with other people, right? So again, this is driving back the impulses and desires of the id if they are deemed unacceptable by society. And this was a very interesting thing to Freud and other people working in that field, because they realized that what happens here with the superego is that we are suppressing a lot of our natural desires if we don't think they are acceptable in our society. All right. So with the ego, we might suppress a desire if it seems irrational to our conscious minds. But with the superego, we might suppress a desire because we know other people don't like it, or we know it doesn't really conform to the standards of our society or our culture. So, what Freud and others would say, what happens as a result of that, if you have like a really overactive superego, you're going to have a bit of a you're gonna feel very guilty. You're gonna have a very prominent sense of guilt because you're gonna feel like you're constantly doing things wrong or you're violating certain norms. But also, when the id is sort of driven away, when the id is suppressed, whether it's suppressed by the ego or the superego, it doesn't cease to exist, right? Again, we might like to think that. Like, oh, I want this thing, but I know I shouldn't do it. So I'm just going to tell myself no, either because I want to be rational or I want to fit in with my society. I'm going to tell myself no, and hopefully I'll stop wanting it. But you guys know that's not really how human desire works, right? If you really want that piece of cake, you can tell yourself you can't have it, but you're still going to want it. You might be able to stop yourself from having it, but you don't get rid of the desire. The desire just gets suppressed. The desire gets pushed underneath a lot of conscious thought, and it becomes very unconscious. It becomes a part of your unconscious mind. But what these guys would say is it's still there, right? You might not be consciously aware of it, but that desire, whatever you're trying to tamp down, it's still operating within your brain. It's still making you do things. It's still making you feel certain ways. You just might not be consciously aware of it. So ideally, a very well-regulated person would be able to strike a balance between these three parts of the human mind. We all have an id. It's healthy to have an id, but we would also have a pretty healthy ego and a healthy superego, not too pronounced of a superego, because again, we don't want to feel bad about ourselves because we think we're constantly doing a bad job of controlling our id. But if all of these are kind of in the right proportion with one another, we should be sort of, relatively content with our functioning. But if one of these things gets out of whack, if our regulating agencies are falling down on the job, or if the ego's overactive or the superego's overactive, we're going to feel bad. Like these will have negative effects on our mental health. But of course, if we let the id run wild, we're probably going to make a lot of poor decisions, and that can also lead to problems. So it's important to just have a general idea about these concepts because we still talk about them and we still generally think that, these are good and sort of productive ways to think about the different parts of our minds. So we definitely use that vocabulary from Freud. But as the book points out, a lot of critics today will point out that the psychoanalytic approach does have limitations. We've already mentioned a few of them, but Freud in particular is often talked about as being somewhat limited by his deep interest in sexuality and the fact that he chalked up a lot of literary symbolism to representing sex or having something to do with sex. So that's a particular approach that we don't necessarily always take today. And the book sort of drives this home. They say that, the psychoanalytic approach can be useful, but there is an overemphasis, perhaps at times, on human sexuality, particularly with the work of Freud and some others that were influenced by him. And that can turn some critics and scholars off, not because they're opposed to thinking about it so much as they don't see it as always being quite as important as maybe the psychoanalytic critics do. But there's a good sort of litmus test for this as far as what you guys think. If you turn to page 207 in the book, so again, the book is a little critical of the psychological approach at times because of these limitations. And this is one of those times at the top of page 207. They're saying, yeah, there's some good stuff you can do with psychoanalytic observations, but people can get frustrated because it might feel like everything leads back to the unconscious mind or sexuality, and it might feel a little bit like a dead end. So if you look at the top of page 207, I want us to think about this paragraph here. So they're saying, yeah, some people get frustrated. And the relevance of some of this has been questioned by many scholars. So this is the next sentence on page 207. We may sympathize with their incredulousness, meaning these scholars who think that maybe the psychological approach can go too far. We can sympathize with that when we encounter the Freudian essay that interprets even a seemingly innocent fairy tale like Little Red Riding Hood as an allegory of the age-old conflict between male and female, in which the plucky young virgin, whose red cap is a minstrel symbol, outwits the ruthless, sex-hungry wolf. And then they have a citation there, sort of showing that this really is an analysis written by a scholar, and they are citing some of the ideas. But you might notice that they're almost kind of making fun of it and saying, yeah, we understand if some people roll their eyes at this kind of Freudian analysis of Little Red Riding Hood. But I want you guys to think about that little brief reading that they're summarizing the interpretation that somebody has arrived at based on a psychological approach to the fairy tale and decide if you think it's ridiculous. Do you think it's really just totally out of bounds to read Little Red Riding Hood the way it's being read by this scholar from who we see gets cited on page 207? Because I mean, it's totally up to you. Like I said, the authors of the book seem to think, okay, this is the psychological approach going a bit too far. We're being too Freudian. We're reducing everything to sexuality. That's limited. But a lot of people probably read the fairy tale the very way it's being described here. Maybe not the authors of this book, but a lot of scholars interpret the fairy tale to very much be what's described here as the age-old conflict between male and female, in which the plucky virgin outwits the ruthless wolf. So that is how some people read the fairy tale. Some people read it as being very much about that being heavily metaphorical. That's what they mean when they call it an allegory. That's like when everything in the story kind of represents something larger. It's very much operating on the level of figurative language, right? So the young woman represents something larger. The wolf represents something larger, right? We're supposed to see it kind of in figurative terms, like as an extended metaphor. Some people read it that way. Some people don't. It's really up to you. But if this sounds as ridiculous to you as it does to the authors of the book, then maybe you want to limit your use of the psychological approach. But if this reading of the fairy tale strikes you as kind of accurate, or at least not totally off base, then you might disagree with the authors of the book. I think I disagree a little bit. I wouldn't characterize this reading of the fairy tale as ridiculous. I don't think it's the only way to read it, but it's definitely one way to read it. And I would also argue that there's really no such thing as an innocent fairy tale. That's sort of a strange statement. A lot of original fairy tales are actually very dark, and they usually have a moral. They're usually trying to teach us something about like the darkness of human psychology. So I wouldn't buy that Little Red Riding Hood is an innocent fairy tale. I don't even know what that means. but it just depends on how you want to read it. Some people are going to read it as at least somewhat connected to male female relations and sexuality. Other people might read it totally differently. But see what you think about what they're saying at the top of 207, and that might guide you with some of your future decisions as well. So, another sort of important figure in psychoanalysis, somebody that we still kind of use when we're using this approach, is Jacques Lacan, who's a French psychoanalyst. He came along a little bit after Freud. He was sort of, he learned from Freud, but he also replaced some of Freud's stages of development. That's another thing that Freud's kind of famous for. He wrote about how children develop. But again, for Freud, a lot of it had to do with sex and the development of their sort of awareness of their own sexuality and other people's. Lacan is a little bit more interesting for us, perhaps, because he was more interested in linguistic development. And that should remind us of what we were talking about last week with our linguistic approaches, thinking about structuralism and post-structuralism, really thinking about language, signs, and what those signs are supposed to mean, right? The relationship between signifier and the actual meaning of a word. So that's kind of what Lacan's talking about a little bit. He really sees a child developing in large part based on language acquisition. So this is kind of interesting. And again, these are ideas that we can use. These are, this is vocabulary that we can still use. So he talks about the mirror stage as occurring very early in a child's development. So this is when a child first recognizes himself or herself as a separate object, really separate from the mother is the way Lacan describes it. So, yeah, you can think of this as a child literally seeing themselves in the mirror. And if you've ever watched a baby or like a cat or like a some other like less reasoning creature see themselves in the mirror, it can sometimes freak them out. We're not sure if they can fully grasp that they're seeing themselves, right? At least with like cats and other animals, sometimes we might think that they believe they're seeing another cat, right? And even with babies, like it probably takes a little time before they really understand that what they're seeing is just a reflection of themselves. But this is really has a lot to do with like the formation of an identity, right? As we start to understand that we are a person, we are a person, we are separate from other people. We are similar to other people, but we are separate, right? A baby doesn't really know that. So this kind of happens maybe like for an infant or like, I don't know, a toddler. I'm not really sure exactly when this occurs, but this is a very important early development, a very important stage in early childhood development, according to Lacan. But he also says when children are really little, they live in what he calls an imaginary world or the world of the unconscious. And this is largely a world without language. So he's talking about like before a kid learns how to talk, right? They live in the world of the unconscious. So this is a world of images and desires, not really a logical order. What provides logic and order is language. And the kid doesn't have language yet. So the kid can't really articulate how he feels, right? Or what he thinks. But a kid has sensory impressions, right? They're seeing things, they are hearing things, smelling things, tasting things. So they're forming they're learning constantly. They're experiencing new things, but they don't have words to express those experiences. So Lacan says this is largely sort of an imaginary, unconscious world, right? And it's also very connected to the mother. Of course, again, we're kind of going back in time, right? Lacan and Freud were writing at a time when most mothers stayed at home and nursed their children, and most fathers would have been gone most of the time working. That's not necessarily the case always today, but the idea is the child would almost always be around their mother. Not so much their father, or not even so much their siblings or other people. They would be mostly around their mother during these early stages. So they would associate their mother with their unconscious thoughts, right? The images, the desires, this nonverbal sort of unconscious world, that's the world of the baby and the mother. But then the baby gets older, the child begins to learn language. And that's when it leaves the imaginary realm and enters what Lacan calls the symbolic stage. So that's where we learn language and we become members of a language community, like I was talking about last week. So we learn all of the rules, the standards, and the norms that go along with our particular language community. And Lacan argues that when a kid goes through that process, a lot of what they have to do is start suppressing stuff in their unconscious mind. Back in the imaginary world, pre language, there's no suppression, right? And if you notice, like with really young kids, you'll notice this. They don't have a filter, they don't really know what's appropriate and what's not. You know, they'll just do things that even older kids would never do, right? Older kids would be mortified to just start peeing in front of a bunch of adults. But a little tiny kid, they don't care. Like, they don't know. They don't feel any sense of shame if they just start using the bathroom in front of people. Even like a slightly older kid would be embarrassed, right? Because that older kid has an ego and a super ego, even though they're still, very small. They're already learning what's acceptable and what's not. But a really little kid, a kid that's kind of pre-verbal, certainly, a kid in that imaginary stage, they're not suppressing anything. If they want something, they want it. If they want to do something, they do it, right? There's no problem there. But as they learn language, they have to start learning standards, norms, what constitutes acceptable behavior, right? And most of that's communicated through language, right? If they do something wrong, they get punished, they get yelled at, they get told, no, don't do that. That's wrong. You can't do that. And also, that applies to certain desires they might feel, certain things that they want. They're told, no, that's wrong. You can't have that. So they suppress those desires, and those desires go back to the unconscious realm. And the kid is able to act socially acceptably in the more conscious realm, if that makes sense. But this is a very important transition as the kid enters that symbolic stage. Lacan defines the symbolic stage as being defined by symbols, right? Signs, language. This is when language and social rules really deliver meaning and really sort of control behavior, control what people do. You have to follow certain rules within your family, within society, right? This could mean laws, like things that are literally illegal to do, but also just like social norms, right? It's not polite to say that to somebody. It's not polite to start peeing in front of your grandmother right before we eat dinner, right? That just goes without saying once a kid acquires language, once a kid understands standards, norms, and how to participate in a larger language community. But the unconscious is still there, right? It remains submerged. It remains kind of unnoticed, but it continues to function. And what Lacan talks about is the unconscious has a language of its own. Unconscious language is different from conscious language. Conscious language would be very logical, very reasonable, easy to follow. But unconscious language is largely done through metaphor, through figurative language, right? We're not trying to capture literal meanings. We're trying to capture feelings or desires or things in our unconscious mind that we feel, but maybe we can't fully articulate. So we use figurative language to express those things. So a lot of times you'll hear that, for the unconscious mind, metaphor. For the conscious mind, just really straightforward factual writing. And you can kind of see how those two levels would work differently. So this world of symbols, this world of language and rules, that's often associated with the father. according to Lacan's theory. Again, we don't have to believe all of this, but the basic idea is young children associate the imaginary or the unconscious with their mother, and that's more of a liberating sort of free zone versus the world of language. That's rules and standards, and that's usually enforced by an authority figure, which to Lacan and Freud would have been a man, right, primarily. So in their vision, the man, the father represented law, represented language, and the mother represented this more kind of open-ended, flexible, unconscious stage. So even if we only want to take bits and pieces of that larger theory, we can find that some of that will help us when we're analyzing certain literary texts. But this idea of the mother representing certain things and the father representing certain things, that was important for Freud too. So you might have heard of the Oedipus complex. They talk about that a little bit in the book, and it's similar kind of to what Lacan's getting at here. Freud theorizes that all boys, all young men, as they sort of come of age, they eventually come into conflict with their father. And again, this might not be a literal conflict between the two individuals, but it might be more like a figurative thing. Like the young man comes into conflict with what the father represents, because the father represents law and reason and language, and the young man might want to do other things, or the young man might want to break free from his social standards or the norms that govern his life. So that might mean sort of like a symbolic revolt against the law and order of the father. So that's another kind of related theory that we can use sometimes to help us understand certain characters, certain stories, and certain themes. So let's take a quick look at the examples in the book of using the psychological approach on Frankenstein and then on to his coy mistress. So if you flip over to page 215, you'll see a psychological analysis on Frankenstein. And you'll notice that they are talking, I think, a little bit about the Oedipal complex, the sort of revolt against patriarchy. And the claim here is that Victor is sort of doing that, but the creature might also be doing that. They are rebelling, right? So we can understand their psychological processes a little bit better. And there's some other Freudian concepts that they are using to better understand the text through that psychological lens. So you might find that one pretty useful. The more in-depth analysis would be over on 218. Concerning to his coy mistress. So they get into a little bit more detail here. They go through the poem and really identify a lot of sexual imagery that they think is important to the overall meaning of the text. If any of this stuff makes you guys feel uncomfortable, or if you just don't want a bunch of college professors talking to you about sexual imagery, you can skip over those. I'm not going to make you read those examples if you're uncomfortable with the content. But it's just stuff to know, stuff that's there if you need it. And again, you don't have to get too deep into Freudian or the Lacan stuff. You can really just focus on, motivations, why characters are doing things, psychological effects on audience members. It's always fair game. But also, yeah, if you're doing any kind of psychological analysis in a literary text, try to think about id, ego, and superego, and see if you can use some of those Lacanian terms as well. The mirror stage, the imaginary pre-language stage, and then the symbolic stage, which is very much about language. You don't have to only apply those to works that have children in them, right? We can talk about those as just being parts of human development, and again, for all people. And again, what's interesting about some of these concepts with psychoanalysis is this stuff doesn't go away, right? So again, like a big thing that a psychoanalyst might try to do in a therapy session with their patient is to try to get them to better understand suppressed memories or suppressed desires from childhood. right? Stuff that's really old, but maybe unresolved. So just because we're talking about adults doesn't mean that we can't go back to childhood development. We can't go back to the mirror stage or that transition from pre-language to language, because that stuff stays with us, right? A lot of that stuff that we push away once we join the language community, that stuff remains in our unconscious mind, and we might need to deal with it at some point. So, these are just some interesting tools that you can use. And if you like psychology, if you're interested in the career field, then I definitely recommend looking more into the psychological approach. All right, so that's it for this week. Next week, we move on to mythology and archetypes. So, like I said, we are moving pretty quickly for the next several weeks. I want to cover a new critical approach each week through week 11. And then by week 12, we're ready to get to work on our next critical response. So, if you're feeling a little confused, if you feel like you've missed something, if you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week.